Hello and welcome. I'm Althea Brooks. I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the UVA's Office of Engagement. We're thrilled to welcome you for the first time our Back to Lifetime Learning Spring Symposium 2023. Today's program is part of Lifetime Learning's Building a New Nation, the role of 4 Virginia presidents. Thank you for joining us for talks last week on George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. We're fortunate to have Tyson Reeder from the papers of James Madison at the University of Virginia to speak with us this afternoon on James Madison's presidency. He'll be introduced shortly. We look forward to you sharing questions during this program in the Q&A box. Also, closed captioning is available should you need it at the bottom of your screen. Please help me thank in advance our moderator for these programs, Alan Taylor. He's the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair in the Cochrane Department of History at UVA. Alan, thank you for moderating the lectures and panel discussions for Spring Symposium. Now, please help me welcome the longstanding faculty leader for Lifetime Learning Summer Jefferson Symposium, John Ragasta. John's a great friend. He's the interim Saunders Director at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. John is a double who, and he's taught at the University of Virginia and George Washington University. John has also taught at Hamilton, Oberlin, and Randolph colleges. He's a thought leader on Jefferson and Patrick Henry. John's the author of 2 books on religious freedom and has co-edited The Founding of Thomas Jefferson's University 2019, published in 2019. John's latest book will be published this year, For the People, for the Country, Patrick Henry's Final Political Battle. John, thank you for 12 years as our faculty leader for our Summer Jefferson Symposium. We appreciate all that you do to make those educational programs successful and rich with content. We can't do those programs without you, so please never retire. John, the microphone's all yours, and I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Althea, and thank you to Lifetime Learning. It's so wonderful and relatively easy to do a program with Althea and her team at Lifetime Learning because they do just such a super job in bringing us all sorts of interesting programs, and it's always a pleasure to work on those programs. We welcome those of you who are coming back, who were with us last week when we had a discussion with Lindsay Travinsky about George Washington, my discussion about President Thomas Jefferson. And we're looking forward this week to talking about James Madison and James Monroe, perhaps a little bit less well known than Jefferson and Washington. It was interesting to me in listening to Lindsay talk about Washington and in my conversation about Jefferson, how often those issues interlocked and how many issues were really overlapping. So I'm looking forward to our discussion tomorrow on a moderated panel when we'll hear from all of these things, from all of these different speakers. But today we're going to start with hearing about James Madison. Historically, the conventional wisdom has always seen Madison as a second to Jefferson, as a lieutenant, sort of under Jefferson. I think more recent scholarship has really made a point that they're really equal participants in the founding of the country and in the presidency. I think even that gets it a little bit wrong. I see Jefferson as a yin and a yang. They are both essential. They are complementary. They agree on many things, but they also have very, very different perspectives. So I'm going to be interested in hearing from that today from Tyson. But let me start by introducing Alan Taylor, who's our moderator, and he will have the opportunity to introduce Tyson. Alan, of course, is known to many of you. He's not only the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair at the University of Virginia, he has taught previously at Boston University and the University of California at Davis. He has 10 books. He has won virtually every prize that one can win for a historic volume, from the Pulitzer Prize to the Bancroft, the Beveridge Prize. He is also, importantly, I won't go through his whole vita, but importantly, he has been inducted to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society, and he is an excellent commentator on all of these issues. So Alan, please take it away.
Thank you, John, for that very kind introduction. And I will be assisted by James Madison today, who will be fact-checking and everything that Tyson has to say. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Tyson. I had the pleasure of working with Tyson when he was a graduate student working on his dissertation at UC Davis. And he has been a great success in his career, and his career is still early. He currently is an assistant professor and the editor of the papers of James Madison here at UVA. He is the author of Smugglers, Pirates, and Patriots, Free Trade in the Age of Revolution, which published in 2019. And it's a great read. It makes a great Christmas present or Hanukkah present or anybody's birthday. He has a forthcoming book with a great title, Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Foreign Collusion in James Madison's America, which will, of course, be a very timely book. He also serves as the editor of the Rutledge History of U.S. Foreign Relations. So I'll turn it over to Tyson. I'm very much looking forward to what he has to say about James Madison, but Madison is even more interesting what he has to say.
Thank you, Alan. And I want to thank John and Althea and everybody who's helped to make this possible, including Ashley and Dana and Tresia. And I want to thank everybody for being here. My one regret is I can't see our audience in person, but it's great to be able to do this via Zoom and be able to reach a wide audience. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I want to start actually with a poll. I'd like to get everybody's opinion on presidential power. So you should have a poll in front of you. If you could take just a couple of minutes to, well, a couple of seconds, hopefully, to read over that and just give a quick opinion. And we're actually going to come and look back at this toward the end. And in fact, I will give my own opinion on this poll. So my answer has been submitted. Let me pull up my screen real quick and share my screen. So thank you for participating in that poll. And like I said, we will come back and revisit our results toward the end here. To begin, I want us to go back to May of 1787. Now, by May of 1787, James Madison had spent years thinking about a new constitution for the United States. For him, the ideal charter would convert the states from a loose confederation into a nation. In his opinion, the new Articles of Union, as he called the Constitution before it became the Constitution, would grant Congress power to compel taxes from the people rather than request them from the states, deter encroachments by the states on federal authority, regulate interstate commerce, prohibit state-issued paper money, and strengthen the domestic and foreign credit of the United States. All things he considered impossible under the Articles of Confederation. Now, since the winter of 1784, he had been studying from the brightest minds on law and diplomacy. And in 1786, he took achingly detailed notes on past confederacies, their constitutions, their characteristics, their strengths, and their defects. He began to systematize his thoughts on paper, as you can see here, and to harmonize his ambitious vision of a politically diverse nation with a strong central government that would protect liberty without succumbing to foreign meddling. He imagined a powerful central bicameral legislature, each house composed of state representatives proportionate to their state population. The national legislature would possess power never considered under the Articles of Confederation, including the authority to veto state laws. An independent federal judiciary would compel states to abide by international law and pay international debts. And finally, these Articles of Union should be ratified by the people of the United States, not the state legislatures. For all of his thinking, Madison spent almost no time pondering the executive branch. A month before the Constitutional Convention convened, he told a couple of friends, including George Washington, a national executive must also be provided, I have scarcely ventured as yet to form my own opinion either of the manner in which it ought to be constituted or of the authorities with which it ought to be clothed. The presidency, as the executive came to be called, was an afterthought for Madison, a necessary but incidental check on a legislature that he planned to imbue with tremendous power. Despite the lack of forethought to the presidency, Madison would shape the institution for the next 3 decades as a key delegate at the Constitutional Convention, President George Washington's earliest advisor, a role some have compared to a prime minister, hence my title, a leader of the nation's first opposition party, and finally, wielding executive power for 16 years, first as Jefferson's Secretary of State and then as president. For a person initially so disinterested in the executive branch, he spent the next 30 years influencing it in subtle but profound ways. He exerted a longer-term impact on the office than any person since, less drastic than some presidents, to be sure, but more sustained than any of them. So I want to examine that influence through those 4 inflections: the Constitutional Convention, his advisorship to Washington, his opposition leadership, and his executive tenures. Steeped in republicanism from his college days until the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Madison gave little thought to an executive except to condemn monarchy and warn that monarchy would emerge from the chaos of the Confederation government of the 1780s. He confided to his political mentor, Edmund Pendleton, about, speaking of Massachusetts and New England, that disorder under the Articles of Confederation had caused inexpressible injury to the Republican character in that part of the United States, and a propensity towards monarchy is said to have been produced by it in some leading minds. The bulk of the people will probably prefer the lesser evil of a partition of the Union into 3 more practicable and energetic governments. So what he called the lesser evil, Madison preferred the dissolution of the Union to monarchy. He warned the delegates at the Constitutional Convention that if they did not save Republican government, it is much to be feared the time is not distant when in universal disgust they will renounce the blessing which they have purchased at so dear a rate and be ready for any change that may be proposed to them, hinting at monarchy. Like Madison, Alexander Hamilton argued that if we incline too much to democracy, we shall soon shoot into a monarchy. Unlike Madison, he viewed anarchy as the greater threat. In a candid moment within the secrecy of the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton admitted that he did not think favorably of Republican government, using his words, hinting that he wouldn't have minded if monarchy replaced anarchy. He appealed to those who did favor republicanism, warning that they needed to save it by creating a stronger government. So Madison and Hamilton disagreed about the implications of potential anarchy. Hamilton feared anarchy as the consummate political evil, whereas Madison more sincerely feared that anarchy would end in monarchy. They began to work on distinct but almost parallel tracks to fix the problem. And I say almost parallel because those tracks would run side by side for a time, but all the while edging closer and closer to collision, which would occur not long after the ratification of the Constitution. Though Madison found the debates over the executive tedious and reiterated, to use his words, he became more invested in a stronger president after July 16th, the date the convention adopted the Connecticut Compromise. Now, for those who need a refresher, the compromise settled a dispute between large state delegates such as Madison, who wanted population-based apportionment in Congress, and small state delegates who wanted equal state representation. The convention, as many of you probably know, eventually based House representation on population, including 3/5 of the enslaved population of each state, the 3/5 clause as it came to be called, and delegates based Senate representation on state equality. The solution though, was less of a compromise and more of a win for the small state delegates who defeated Madison's tenacious push for proportional representation in both houses. Madison wanted to remove any vestiges of state power over the federal government, fearful that small states would enjoy outsized influences they did under the Articles of Confederation. Before the compromise, he usually favored limiting executive power in favor of Congress, such as the ability to appoint judges, which he believed should lie with the Senate. The Connecticut Compromise changed his calculus once it granted equal state representation in the Senate. Fearing that the state-centered Senate tainted his vision for a national Congress, Madison became more willing to grant the executive powers that he would have otherwise preferred the legislature possess. He shifted his position from state control of judicial appointments to shared control with the president. He persuaded his fellow delegates to grant the president more control over the appointment of ambassadors, public ministers, and other federal officers, stripping the Senate of sole responsibility. Madison hadn't made a complete about-face on presidential power, or to put it another way, he hadn't sided with Hamilton. He advocated for an impeachment clause, arguing that the 4-year term agreed upon was not enough to check potential presidential abuse of power. After the Constitution reached its final form, Madison still considered the presidency, to use his phrase, the weaker department. Because he had thought so little about the executive before the convention, Madison was malleable in the manner of its selection. He preferred election of the president by popular vote. Once the Connecticut Compromise made the legislature a mix of proportional representation and state representation, popular election of the president seemed the surest way to create a truly national branch. Other delegates protested, some of them distrusting the people's aptitude for selecting a chief magistrate, and the convention quickly scrapped the idea of popular election for the president. Instead, the delegates opted for electors. Although Madison and other Southerners initially disliked the idea, they warmed to it because the number of electors from each state would be based on the state's total number of senators and representatives. Because the 3/5 clause increased the number of representatives in the South, it also increased their electoral votes. Madison had proposed the idea of basing the enslaved population on a compromise ratio, and the convention adapted the 3/5 scale from a number he had proposed in a different context years earlier in the Confederation Congress. Although Madison preferred a popular vote, he accepted the Electoral College as a fair solution, and it gained favor in the South, at least indirectly through his influence. Madison manifested his lack of forethought about the executive at the Constitutional Convention. His ideas were pliant and sometimes vague, though he may have characterized them as moderate and balanced. He advocated a strong, independent executive, but emphasized that executive powers should be limited and defined. Otherwise, he warned, we shall see the evils of elective monarchies. Through the ambiguities, we begin to discern Madison trying to reconcile the need for an independent national executive with his aversion to monarchy. That aversion would eventually cause his rupture with Hamilton as the two men became close advisors to President George Washington. Hamilton as the Secretary of State and Madison serving in an advisory role, again akin to Prime Minister. Throughout 1788, Washington subtly cheered Madison's push for ratification of the Constitution and his election to Congress. On his way to the Capitol at New York, Madison stopped by Mount Vernon to confer with President-elect Washington. Together, the Virginians wrote Washington's inaugural address after scrapping a 73-page behemoth that was written by Washington's secretary, David Humphreys. That's one thing I think that we can all give Madison thanks for in terms of presidential precedents, shorter inaugurals. They also discussed the approaching business of governing in the new constitutional era. Madison departed for New York while Washington waited at home for his official notification of his election. Together in the Capitol by late April, they finished Washington's inaugural address. After Washington delivered the address to Congress on April 30th, he asked Madison to write a reply from the House. So, as a measure of how closely Madison collaborated with the executive office during his first term in the new Congress, he wrote the president's inaugural, the House's reply to the president's inaugural, then the president's reply to the House's reply. Madison was carrying on a two-way conversation with himself. Incidentally, he also wrote the president's reply to the Senate's reply. Washington could not populate his cabinet until some of his secretaries were confirmed in New York, which did not begin to happen until August and September of 1789. He relied on Madison for advice and insight in the meantime. In his advice to Washington, Madison advanced his suspicions of the Senate in favor of an independent executive. The Constitution specified little about what advice and consent of the Senate meant when it came to the president's power to make treaties and fill appointments, for example. The charter left vague which branch would control the process, where they would meet, what advice meant, how much counsel the president would take with the Senate, and so forth. On Madison's advice, Washington insisted that such prerogatives should lie with the president, wresting power from the Senate. The Constitution also left hazy how much control the Senate possessed in dictating the diplomatic service, including the assignments and compensation of U.S. diplomats. When Washington asked Madison's counsel, Madison convinced Washington that the Senate's powers extend no farther than to an approbation or disapprobation of the person nominated by the president. All the rest being executive and vested in the president by the Constitution. Now, Madison may have overstated the constitutional clarity on the matter, but he had little interest in siphoning power from the nationally elected president to the state-centered Senate. Madison didn't trust executive power so much as he distrusted Senate power since the Connecticut Compromise. Washington relied on Madison's input when making the breathtaking number of appointments to federal office. Those around Washington knew that it was useful to have Madison's ear when seeking appointment. Madison's influence with Washington grew so powerful that he irritated some senators who considered it a violation of senatorial authority. As a bridge between Congress and the executive, Madison stood at the center of the government. A French diplomat described him as the representative most renowned for his knowledge, his activity, and his integrity. Madison helped Washington form his cabinet, giving positive assessments of each of the first four secretaries nominated by Washington, including Alexander Hamilton, which Madison would come to regret. By the end of May, Madison knew that at least 3 executive officers would oversee the Treasury, Foreign Affairs, and War departments. He assumed either John Jay or Alexander Hamilton would head the Treasury Department. He had worked with both on the Federalist Papers during the ratification debates, and despite that cooperation, he had an acrimonious relationship with Jay dating back to the 1780s, and he wasn't really close to Hamilton. Of the two, he considered Hamilton better qualified. Madison almost certainly believed that Hamilton would back his calls in Congress for anti-British imposts. The Constitution had finally given Congress the ability to tax imports, and Madison wanted to retaliate against Britain's restrictions on U.S. commerce. In one Federalist essay, Hamilton had insisted that the Constitution would unite Americans enough to force Britain to the bargaining table. With his appointment as Treasury Secretary, however, Hamilton descended from the clouds of theory to the mire of practice. He may have dreamed of a day when the United States could command international respect by economic coercion. For the time, however, he believed the United States needed Britain. Hamilton yearned to improve America's faltering public credit, and he could ill afford a trade war. Americans received most of their foreign goods from Britain. If they taxed those imports, the Treasury would lack money to pay its debt. To save his plan, Hamilton needed to defeat Madison's. The two men spotted the opening cracks in their political partnership. Madison's most important role in forming the new cabinet was to convince Thomas Jefferson to accept the position of Secretary of State. On October 8th, Madison sat in Washington's executive mansion. He had tarried in New York more than a week after the first session of Congress closed, waiting for Jefferson, whose return from France he expected any time. The pair planned to talk politics while they traveled to Virginia together. Jefferson hadn't arrived, and Madison could wait no longer. He visited the president to bid farewell until Congress reconvened early the next year. Washington solicited Madison's advice a final time before his unofficial counselor departed the Capitol. The president asked Madison if he thought the executive branch should send Gouverneur Morris as an unofficial emissary to London to smooth differences with Britain. And Madison disliked the idea. He preferred economic coercion to what he considered diplomatic kowtowing. Britain had yet to send an emissary to the United States, and Americans would betray weakness if they betrayed the first move. He wanted to force Britain's compliance with his impost bill. Without that pressure, Morris's mission would look more like a cry for pity than a demand for justice. Madison also likely objected to Morris's appointment for the same reason Hamilton supported it. Both men viewed Morris as pro-British. Madison saw forces combining to undermine his plan to exact British respect. He advised Washington to delay his decision until he consulted Jefferson, who was returning from France and had no idea he had been nominated and confirmed as Secretary of State. And Madison had no idea that Jefferson still lingered an ocean away in France, tormented by merciless wind and rain while he waited for decent weather to sail. Now, Jefferson didn't arrive in the United States until November 23rd, and he didn't receive Washington's official request to serve as Secretary of State until December 11th. The last week of the year, Madison rode to Monticello to discuss the appointment in person and convince Jefferson to accept it. He returned to New York, confident he had succeeded. Jefferson did arrive in the city to assume the office on March 21st, 1790, but the delay gave Hamilton nearly 6 months to steer U.S. foreign policy. With Jefferson stuck in Europe, Madison had lost his chance to foil Morris's appointment. On October 13th, 1789, Washington had selected Morris, who was in France on business at the time. Through Hamilton's back channel communications with Britain, Whitehall knew about the possible mission before Morris did. By stepping into Jefferson's void, Hamilton committed the United States to diplomacy rather than commercial warfare. As his influence with Washington grew, Madison's diminished. No longer an unofficial prime minister, Madison would team with Jefferson as leaders of the opposition party, formulating their own vision for the nation once they took executive power. When revolutionary France declared war on Britain in 1793, Americans split their sympathy between the two nations. Madison and Jefferson mustered Republicans who favored France against Hamilton's Federalists who favored Britain. The parties remained fluid, ill-defined, and nowhere near as organized as modern political parties. Even so, their adherents demanded loyalty from each other, and the parties provided a platform for opposition politics. As far as Madison could see, monarchists in Europe and crypto-monarchists in America conspired to overthrow republicanism in France and the United States. He believed Washington overstepped presidential bounds when he declared neutrality in the conflict between Britain and France. Now, Madison didn't want to fight Britain, but he believed peace and war were questions for Congress, not unilateral decisions for the president. He believed Hamilton had duped Washington into copying Europe's monarchical model, as he called it. The independent executive he had favored was becoming the monarchical executive he had feared. In 1795, Republicans and Federalists cemented their animosity as they debated the Jay Treaty. Washington had sent John Jay to Europe to resolve lingering disputes between Britain and its former colonies. With Madison leading the charge, Republicans decried the Federalist Backed Accord, arguing that it subjected the United States to British economic might. The treaty controversy permanently fractured Madison and Washington's political partnership, thrusting them to opposing sides of an increasingly vitriolic two-party system. In his farewell address of 1796, Washington implored his fellow Americans, quote, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, for history proved that it is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Now, most Americans today remember the exhortation in Washington's farewell address as a timeless piece of nonpartisan wisdom. Madison considered it a poorly masked attack on Republicans. Washington relied on Hamilton to prepare the final text of his farewell address. To Madison, the message proved that Washington languished in the snares of the British faction. That's Madison's phrase. Madison still preferred to believe that Federalist advisors misguided the honorable but hoodwinked president. In truth, Hamilton had tempered Washington's language. In his initial draft, the president condemned the Madison-led effort in the House to scuttle the Jay Treaty and subtly rebuked Madison for his accusations of presidential overreach. When Washington warned against foreign encroachments, he meant France. When he warned against party spirit, he meant Republicans. Hamilton helped him dress the Federalist message in nonpartisan prose, but Washington's former prime minister had become persona non grata in the administration. By 1798, the United States edged toward war with France as Federalists accused the European power of violating U.S. neutrality. Convinced that Republicans cooperated with France to undermine the Adams administration, Federalists passed the Sedition Act, proscribing slander against the president. Republicans reviled the act as a ploy to criminalize political dissent. And with varying degrees of sincerity, Federalists insisted that the laws repelled foreign interference and corrupt collusion, but Madison saw nothing but a Federalist political power grab. Perhaps it is a universal truth, he despaired, that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. He echoed his own speech before the Constitutional Convention over a decade earlier. The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home. Between 1798 and 1800, Madison shepherded his logic into a coherent philosophy on limited government and freedom to criticize a non-sacrosanct executive. Madison maintained his devotion to civil liberty, but he reversed his theory about how to safeguard it. In the late 1780s, he believed a strong federal government would protect individual rights from domineering state governments. By 1800, he saw the federal government as more prone to trample liberty. States retained the right to judge the constitutionality of laws, he insisted. Otherwise, the government would consolidate into a single national sovereign and pave the way to monarchy, again, his phrase. To prevent that travesty, the federal government shouldered the burden to prove that it exercised constitutional power, something it could not do with the Sedition Act. Now, Madison's expansive interpretation of the First Amendment would not become American gospel until after the Civil War, but his early resistance and writings became foundational to that development. When Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, he intended to put the ship of state back on her Republican tack, he wrote a friend, and she will now shew by the beauty of her motion, the skill of her builders. Madison shifted from minority opposition leader to executive official when Jefferson nominated him as Secretary of State. With executive power, Jefferson and Madison faced the same sorts of accusations they had leveled against Washington's and Adams's Federalist administrations. Weeks after Jefferson's inauguration, France and Spain finalized a secret arrangement devised months earlier. Spain would transfer possession of its massive Louisiana territory to France. The Jefferson administration worried that French power in the Americas would threaten national sovereignty and plunge the United States deeper into European affairs. By early 1803, with difficulties mounting in Europe and the Caribbean, Napoleon abandoned his dream of a resurgent American empire. He sold the Louisiana territory to the United States. The purchase had removed, according to Jefferson, the greatest source of danger to our peace. Madison and Jefferson believed that the Louisiana Purchase vindicated their vision of a republican government. They had doubled the size of the nation and dispatched the powerful French from their borders without a massive army or onerous taxes. The triumphant president predicted that he had delivered Federalists their coup de grace. Some virulent Federalists slipped into the minority rhetoric Republicans had innovated during the 1790s, accusing their opponents of monarchical designs undergirded by a foreign enemy. Napoleon conferred the kingly honor of Louisiana on Jefferson and made him president for life, jeered one satirist. One griped that Republicans seemed disposed to make Jefferson Lord Paramount over Louisiana. Comparing Jefferson to Napoleon, Federalist Timothy Pickering warned that in 4 years it will be proposed to elect him president for life. One image showed Napoleon creeping behind Jefferson, whispering, "You shall be king hereafter." While in the minority during the 1790s, Madison and Jefferson had ironically modeled the rhetoric that Federalists employed once their fortunes were reversed. Madison's own presidency is most remembered for his inept leadership during the War of 1812. Wartime presidential powers and even government powers generally contradicted the theory of government Madison and Jefferson had tried to develop for over 2 decades. We don't remember Madison for unilaterally suspending habeas corpus like Lincoln, enforcing onerous sedition and espionage acts like Wilson, en masse imprisonment of large segments of the citizenry like Roosevelt, or assuming sweeping war powers like Johnson, or expanding government surveillance mechanisms like Bush. Nevertheless, a limited focus on the War of 1812 distracts from the ways Madison contributed to executive power over military conflicts. At Madison's suggestion, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention changed the wording that granted Congress power to make war with the more limited ability to declare war. The more restrictive language gave the president as commander-in-chief the ability to conduct warfare and respond to immediate threats with military action. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison all used that power to wage several limited, undeclared wars on Native American nations, France, and North African states. Also, during the War of 1812, some questioned whether states could raise professional armies. Madison defended the power of the national government to monopolize a standing military force, one of the many times we see his earlier nationalist impulses awaken. As the prime innovator of the role of First Lady, Dolly Madison contributed to the ambivalence of the presidential aura. Because Jefferson was widowed by the time he assumed the presidency, Dolly acted as the First Lady either in spirit or in fact for 16 years. One commentator remarked that she answered all my ideas of royalty. Like Washington, she tried to balance the glamour of executive authority with the expectations of Republican simplicity. A close political ally for her husband, she helped the president stake ground somewhere between Washington's cold formality and Jefferson's flagrant informality. In 1810, Madison faced, in his words, serious questions as to the authority of the executive. U.S. nationals living in the Spanish-controlled regions of Baton Rouge, which was called West Florida at the time, declared independence from Spain and requested annexation to the United States. For years, Madison believed that the region belonged to the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase, and directed subordinates to instigate the request, but it came while Congress was recessed. For good reason. Madison feared that if he failed to occupy West Florida, lawless revolutionaries would foment anarchy, inviting Britain or France to occupy the region as a wartime measure. He reasoned that the volatile geopolitical situation endangered national security and justified immediate military action. The president ordered troops to the region and secured it to the United States without congressional authority, an implied power he had unknowingly granted himself 23 years earlier during the Constitutional Convention. During the War of 1812, troops invaded the rest of West Florida to oust British troops stationed there at the permission of Spain and secure the Gulf Coast. In 1845, James K. Polk would follow Madison's precedent of unilaterally sending U.S. troops to disputed territory, which led to the Mexican-American War in 1846. Well, to conclude, I want to visit the results of the poll that we took earlier about presidential power. And you guys did exactly right. This is about what I suspected, in that we're kind of all over the place. The right balance of power, I guess, has the majority, but some believe there's too much power. Actually, very few of us believe there's too little power. But then there's a good segment that's unsure. We're a little bit all over the place. So I'm grateful that everybody participated in that. Thank you for doing that. And this is the point that I want to bring home with this. Madison never expounded a uniform theory on the proper extent or limits of presidential power. His ideas roamed in an abstract zone between his disdain for monarchy and his desire for a more vigorous national executive. Because of his uncertainty, Madison's career embodied a larger U.S. pattern of periodic swings from presidential frailty to executive supremacy. Today, presidents enjoy unfathomable power, but they depend on Congress's permission for some of their most powerful prerogatives. Presidents exercise incredible discretion in their executive orders and sometimes on tentative authority, but those orders are easily undone by new administrations. Congress and the Supreme Court are becoming entangled in a battle, with Congress trying to abdicate as much power as it can to the president, while the Supreme Court tries to force the president to return power to Congress. Americans have adopted Madison's equivocations about presidential authority, forever unsure how much power we want the president to possess. As bewildered as they were brilliant, Madison and the other framers gave the Constitution an advantageous flexibility to accommodate such wide swings in the concentration of power. We rarely think of Madison as a person who drastically altered the shape or scope of the presidency, but I'm hard-pressed to think of anybody who had a more sustained impact on the office over such a long period of time. Thank you, and I will turn time over to Alan, and I think he'll direct some questions and answers.
Yes, thank you very much, Tyson. That was great. And so I have several questions that have come in from people who've been listening in. And we'd welcome more questions. So please put them into the Q&A as they come to your mind. So one question that came in before your presentation even is if you could say something more about Madison's thoughts about the 3/5 clause. To what degree did he put this forward, support it, or find it problematic? Could you say something about that, please?
Yeah, the 3/5 clause is intricately tied to James Madison. Madison first proposed something like it during the Confederation period, under the Articles of Confederation, when they were trying to give Congress greater ability to collect taxes. And they suspected that, and a lot of people believed that those taxes should depend on state population. And the question is, well, where does the enslaved population come in? And Madison's reasoning went like this. If we're basing this on wealth, and labor to some extent equals wealth, then enslaved people are less likely to work hard because they have no incentive. They have less of an incentive because they do not get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Therefore, maybe we should suppose they do about 3/5 the work of a free person. And therefore, they should count towards 3/5 of the state's population. So those discussions had been happening since the early 1780s. And so when it became clear that Congress was not going to base their when it became clear that Congress was not, that the Constitutional Convention was not going to have a popular election of the president, but that they were going to use electors, Madison again proposed that they use some sort of ratio. And then I believe it was John Dickinson who reached back to what Madison had proposed in the early 1780s and said 3/5 sounds like a fine number. And so that's how they came up with the 3/5 compromise. And obviously for and for obvious reasons, the 3/5 compromise has a terrible history in the United States, and it's I think rightfully seen as a major smirk on the Constitution, and yet I have to say this, in that it was a way of dealing with an institution that already existed. And so the framers did have a choice. Now, this isn't the way that Madison would have thought about this, but I think as we look back in history and think about the 3/5 clause and lament that it made it into the Constitution, the framers did have a choice, though, where they might say, well, and some of the people at the Constitutional Convention did suggest this, and basically say, well, look, we as Northerners don't want the enslaved population to count at all toward population. You are treating them like animals. They are chattel slaves. They are your property. We're not basing our population off the number of horses or cattle that we have. Therefore, the enslaved population should not count at all. Versus Southerners who, would have liked for the enslaved population to count fully toward population, and still not give them the right to vote, obviously. And so the 3/5 clause was a way of dealing with an already abhorrent institution that existed in the United States. And when I think about it, I'm not sure which direction would have been more beneficial in terms of abolishing slavery over time, because if they had gone with what Northerners had said and not counted slaves at all on the assumption that slaves were property, then that becomes closer than anything that made it into the Constitution that suggested that slaves were property and the Constitution would protect them as property. If, on the other hand, you count slaves fully in their full population, well, all that does is give the South more power to protect slavery over the long term. So I think we rightly look at the 3/5 clause and shake our heads at it today that it made it into the Constitution. But in terms of dealing with like I say, already existing abhorrent institution, it may have been the sweet spot in terms of the longer term abolition of slavery. But I'm willing to be convinced otherwise. But that's how I've thought of it.
Well, while we're on the subject of slavery, Madison later in his life becomes the leader of the American Colonization Society, which is kind of anti-slavery, but in a way that is ineffective. How does this affect your assessment of Madison?
Madison, when I think of Madison and slavery, I find that it sometimes helps to compare him with Jefferson. And Jefferson really had no problem voicing a lot of his his conflicts and his conflicted consciousness about slavery. And you can see some of the emotion in his writings as he's trying to deal with liberty and freedom, and yet the reality of slavery and himself holding people in enslaving people. Madison was just not as emotional about that. And when Madison thought in terms of slavery, he, at least in terms of the writings that he allowed to exist, that he didn't destroy or dispose of in some way, he takes very legalistic approaches to slavery. And I think that Madison looked at the colonization society as a practicable remedy, one that, as you say, Alan, was ineffective and obviously came with racist overtones in terms of the assumption that whites and blacks couldn't possibly live together in a shared space. But for Madison, he thought of it in very legalistic terms, and he thought in those same terms with regard, for instance, to the 3/5 clause. If to go back to that for a moment, when he wrote one of the Federalist Papers and was defending the 3/5 clause, he kind of gives a legalistic defense and says, well, we just have to acknowledge that slaves partake of both qualities of property and they're humans, and therefore the 3/5 clause is a nice compromise. And he sort of just thinks in legalistic terms and is able to move on in ways that he doesn't seem to have struggled with it emotionally in the same ways Jefferson did.
Okay. Now, James Madison at the Constitutional Convention, he's not a fan of the so-called Connecticut Compromise, which gives the small states, equal power with the large states in the Senate. So, but we also call, and this seems to be a key compromise in the making of the Constitution, and yet we call Madison the father of the Constitution often. So to what degree, when he leaves the Constitutional Convention, is he happy with what his fellow delegates had produced?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and one that's a little difficult to assess, because Madison himself was in favor of the Constitution. I guess I should put that out right from the beginning. He was in favor of the Constitution. He wanted it ratified. He signed the Constitution, as opposed to another of his political mentors, George Mason, who huffed off and refused to sign it, and also another fellow Virginian, Edmund Randolph. So he did sign it. He did think it was the best they could come up with, but it does make us, I think, rethink a little bit Madison as the father of the Constitution. Madison, I think if we want to continue to think of him as the father of the Constitution, we can think of him in that way, in this sense, that it really was his agenda to completely scrap the Articles of Confederation and to write something completely new at the Constitutional Convention. And he came up with some bare bones outlines of what that Constitution should look like. But he didn't end up getting a lot of what he wanted. And not only did he not get a lot of what he wanted, but some of the most major things that he wanted did not end up making it into the Constitution. Probably even more important than the Connecticut Compromise for Madison was that he wanted the federal Congress to be able to veto state laws. And he was convinced, and he even hints at this, even as he's defending the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, he hints that he's not sure that this new Congress will work, that this new government will work if Congress doesn't have the ability to veto state laws. Because in his mind, that's what caused, egregious state laws, creating paper money, thwarting federal treaties. That caused a lot of the problems in Madison's mind with the Articles of Confederation.
Okay, thank you. Now Madison leads the country into a major war, War of 1812. And that war does not go very well for the United States until the very, very end. To what degree is Madison responsible for the lackluster American performance in that war?
The way that I would, well, to a large degree. How about that? To a large degree. So Madison,
how large? Bigger than a bread basket?
Yeah. So Madison, again, he and Jefferson had spent a couple of decades building a vision for the government that depended on a small military, a small navy, and low taxes. And none of those work during wartime. And so Madison, now some have defended Madison in terms that he was trying to work with a Congress that itself was rather dysfunctional at the time, and a Congress that did push back against raising taxes and other things, and building the military at a quicker pace and so forth. But many of those congressmen had followed Madison and Jefferson's lead. And so Madison does find himself in a war that he has difficulty prosecuting. And that is largely because of his own theories of government that he had been trying to build. We don't get anything, for instance, when the Civil War was going so poorly, we get Abraham Lincoln, who famously goes to the Library of Congress when he's upset with his generals, and he starts to check out books on military warfare, and is constantly trying to figure out how he can win that war. You just don't get that with Madison. He was very hands-off. And so, yeah, he was, I think he fairly has the reputation as an inept war leader, and maybe as much deserves the reputation as leading the nation into a war that it probably shouldn't have ever gotten into in the first place.
What about his relationship with his cabinet and his cabinet selections? They seem to be a pretty pedestrian lot, most of them. And so certainly a lot of the things that go wrong in the War of 1812, we can, lay at the doorstep of some members of his cabinet. But did Madison, what entered into his thinking in appointing members of his cabinet, and to what degree did he defer to members of his cabinet in the major decisions of his presidency?
Yeah, for Madison, he, like you said, that's a great way to describe it, a pedestrian lot. Politics entered into Madison's thinking when he was forming his cabinet. He wanted Monroe as Secretary of State. He wanted to promote Gallatin, who had been the Treasury Secretary. None of those appointments would pass by Congress. There were sectional divisions that Madison had to deal with. And so Madison does put together a very lackluster cabinet. And his relationship with them is distant, I would say. And he recognizes, I think, that they are a lackluster cabinet. So he really doesn't confide much with his cabinet. He doesn't cooperate much with them, and that also obviously hurts the war effort. His relationship with Secretary of War John Armstrong is not great, and Armstrong himself is not a particularly admirable figure in American history, and he had spent a lot of time in France creating tensions with other diplomats before he returned to the United States. And so Madison does have several problems. In fairness to Madison, I would say that he has to deal with the formation of a cabinet at a time when sectional divisions and political divisions have entered into calculations, presidential calculations, that they just didn't before his time. And we can fault him for some of his selections, but we also have to recognize that he was just dealing with some political constraints that other presidents did not have to deal with.
What about in his relationship with the opposition party, the Federalists? To what degree does he contribute to the then polarization of politics in the United States?
For James Madison, throughout the 1790s, he becomes a leader, like I mentioned, of the opposition party. So it's largely due to Madison and his partnership with Jefferson that there is this sort of opposition politics, and not only in opposition politics, but almost a paranoia in politics. And when I say political paranoia, I don't mean that you don't like the other party. I mean that you're convinced that the other party is bringing America to the brink of collapse. And Madison is responsible for a lot of that language. He doesn't use as partisan language as Jefferson. For instance, Madison doesn't use the term Federalists very often. Madison likes to think, at least likes to think of himself as thinking in terms of broader ideology. So he'll talk about republicanism versus monarchism, not in terms of party. He doesn't like to think in those ways, but in practical effects, he does lend credence to other people, to the nation's belief that they're becoming split between those who are committed to republicanism and those who are committed to reviving monarchy or reattaching the United States to Great Britain. And he helps develop a lot of that political paranoia.
Thank you.
I can spend more, I can circle back to this, but if we have more questions, we can visit more of the questions. But there's a lot to say about Madison and the development.
Okay, well, we may circle back to it. Let's see. After the War of 1812, Madison seems to reinvent himself again as a nationalist, and he helps to recreate the Bank of the United States. And then in 1816, he does another U-turn and says, no, the federal government doesn't have the constitutional authority to fund internal improvements. But it's hard to say that how it can have the power to create a bank, but not fund internal improvements. So how do you reconcile that apparent conflict in Madison's thinking?
One is to recognize part of the point, not just in terms of executive power, but just the government's power, that Madison does go back and forth. And he's never seems entirely sure how much power he wants either the president to have or the federal government generally to have. But in terms of the bank, Madison recognized that he was making an about face. Now, it's hard to judge his sincerity, but the way that he defended it for himself was to say that, well, I don't think it's constitutional personally, or I didn't think it was constitutional in the 1790s, but it has been around for so long and been for so long widely accepted as constitutional that I have to accept its constitutionality. So he does make an exception for the bank, but he doesn't make that exception for internal improvements. And one could argue, if you want to defend Madison's consistency, that yes, Madison made the exception for the bank because it had been around for so long, but the discussion around internal improvements didn't have quite the same longevity. And so he could continue to fight the idea of internal improvements and still hold to the bank. If we want a modern way of thinking about this, when Justice Amy Coney Barrett was up for nomination and confirmation in the before the Senate, there was all of a sudden a lot of talk about super precedents, and it obviously was in reference to Roe versus Wade, and a lot of people say, well, what is a super precedent? And Coney Barrett seemed to suggest that she didn't consider Roe versus Wade a super precedent because it had never been completely and widely accepted. No matter what the Supreme Court said, it had never been completely and widely accepted in the United States as settled jurisprudence. If you want some sort of modern analogy, Madison would have said the same about the bank. Just it's now a super precedent.
So it does seem like, and you say that the Madison never reaches a consensus with himself about the powers of the presidency or the relative powers of the federal government. What in your mind explains that waffling on his part on these core issues?
I think for Madison, and I'm not the first to have thought about, you know, the in these terms. But Madison's core consistency to me seems to be as a civil libertarian, and what is going to better protect liberty, the liberty of Americans. And so sometimes he observes US politics and thinks that the states are the problem, that the states are overrunning the rights of creditors, for example, when they pass paper money, or that the states are, particularly Virginia, is infringing on religious liberty. And so he's very skeptical of state power. And then all of a sudden you have the federal government, beginning with Hamilton, who now wants to use the power of the federal government in ways that he considers unjust. And especially when you get to the 1798 Sedition and Alien Acts, that it's all of a sudden the federal government that seems to be the greater threat to civil liberties. And so he changes his mind on that and says, well, no, now we need the states to pull back some of that power in order to protect these liberties.
Okay, thank you. And I wonder if you could just say something about the book that you're working on now with this great title of Serpent in Eden. What have you learned about foreign interference in American politics during the early republic?
Well, it was Russia and China back then too.
Well, that is a revelation.
No, you know what I'm trying to do with this book is to help us understand how we ended up in the War of 1812, but the book covers a long period of time, from the Revolution to the War of 1812. And what I see happening is that Americans enter into a terribly destructive cycle where there is foreign meddling. There is foreign meddling in America's internal politics. Sometimes foreign governments are trying to get their own particular candidate elected. For example, France, there was a minister in the United States who worked to try to get Jefferson elected in 1796. Hamilton worked with all sorts of back channels with Britain to go around the Washington administration and so forth. And so you get some foreign meddling and some foreign collusion, frankly, in politics. But as partisan politics becomes more virulent and more vitriolic, partisans start to accuse each other, not just of having a different vision of US foreign policy, but of somehow betraying the country with that vision and of colluding in utterly corrupt ways. And so that exacerbates partisanship, and that exacerbated partisanship creates more room for foreign governments to step in and meddle in US politics and try to exacerbate that partisanship. So that cycle continues until the War of 1812, and Madison feels prompted to declare war, and he views the war not just as a war against Britain, but as a war to rid the United States of British influence with both Federalists, his political enemies, and also Native American nations who were considered somewhere in a hazy area between dependent subjects of the United States and foreign nations themselves.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for just one more question. And we've got a couple of questions that have come in about Madison's role in the famous Supreme Court decision of Marbury versus Madison. And as we heard before from John, Thomas Jefferson had an extremely negative view of the U.S. Supreme Court as overstepping its bounds. What was Madison's role in Marbury versus Madison, the decision, and what was his general attitude toward the U.S. Supreme Court?
Yes, because the title of the case has his name in it, he obviously had a central role, and it was Madison's duty as the Secretary of State to deliver these midnight commissions to Adams' appointees. And so I won't rehash everything that John already covered, but that's why the lawsuit was against Madison, because Madison was withholding those commissions. And so Marbury sued for the writ of mandamus, and of course the Supreme Court overruled or it struck down as unconstitutional the portion of the Judiciary Act of 1789 that was in play there. For Madison, unfortunately, I have to say that Madison never comments on the Marbury decision. All we can do is know that Jefferson really disliked it, and Jefferson and Madison were often in sync in terms of their political opinions, but Madison just never commented on it after that. I've looked actually to see what he had to say about it. I haven't been able to find anything. So if anybody knows anything, I'd be happy to know. But as far as I can tell, he just didn't comment on it.
Okay, well, thank you, Tyson, and thank you for your presentation today and your responses to questions. And so I'll turn it over to Althea.
Right,
Thank you both. Thank you both. Tyson, just real quick before you leave, the papers of James Madison, is it open to the public? Can anyone come in for a visit to take a look around, research?
So the papers of James Madison is we're a set of editors who create volumes that you can see behind me, red and gray and green volumes on my bookshelf behind me. So you can go to Founders Online. Founders Online is what the website is called, and that is where they are published digitally. UVA also publishes them digitally on their website, but that you need special UVA access. But they're all free to the public and open to the public at Founders Online. And you'll see there not only the collected writings and correspondence of James Madison, but of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that bit of information as well. And Tyson and Alan, that was a fantastic conversation. So thank you for sharing with us about James Madison's presidency. We can't thank you enough for engaging alums and parents, friends around the world today. Today's lecture was recorded and will be available in about a week in the Lifetime Learning's podcast library. And we look forward to you joining us at 3 p.m. today for Nicholas Wood's talk on James Monroe's presidency. In the meantime, visit the Lifetime Learning website for future programs at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. Enjoy a nice lunch, and we look forward to seeing you back here at 3 p.m. today.